In our presentation in May, what we did at RESI is present research on statewide disparities in income, education, and life expectancy. This was kind of collapsed down into one measure. It's the United Nations Human Development Index, which is typically calculated at the country level. We looked at and analyzed this at the census tract level. You can see a lot of the results up here where green is, represents areas that have better outcomes for residents. So higher levels of educational attainment and educational enrollment, longer life expectancy, much higher per capita income. And you can see that that's really concentrated kind of in the central Maryland region. So in the wealthier suburbs of Baltimore County, Howard County, Montgomery County. And then you have areas that are in kind of an orange or down to a deep red. And those are areas with worse outcomes for residents. Those are typically in some of our urban areas, such as Baltimore City, also in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. You can also see kind of broad swaths on the Eastern Shore and in Western Maryland. And so in thinking about these disparities, we tend to see them most strongly locally. And I think this is just kind of zooming in. This is one really great way to visualize the really stark differences that exist all across Maryland, but that are also present here. And so I think if you are thinking about Baltimore City and Baltimore County and you put any sort of map up on a screen, it's going to look somewhat similar to this, right? But what we're really seeing are the areas in green, so northern Baltimore County, the kind of very prosperous north-south corridor in the middle of the city, down in the Inner Harbor. Those areas are really well off for residents. They offer residents good outcomes. But areas that for a number of long-standing systemic reasons that go back generations, other areas of our city and county do not have the same levels of outcomes for residents. And so what you end up seeing are places such as Worthington Ridge, which is up by Caves Valley Golf Course, which has one of the highest actual values for the Human Development Index in the state at 0.9788. I should note that if this census tract was a country, it would be Norway, and Norway has a pretty paltry HDI of only 0.92. So, we have areas within Baltimore City and Baltimore County that kind of blow the rest of the world's averages just out of the water. But then from Worthington Ridge, if you drive down I-83 just a few minutes, you get to the neighborhood of Poppleton in downtown Baltimore. And this is the census tract that has the lowest Human Development Index score in the state of Maryland. That is not for a census tract that has a prison in it. And so you have these areas where you have massive gaps in life expectancy, in income, in educational attainment rates. You have areas in Baltimore City that border each other where the life expectancy is different by over 20 years. You have areas in Baltimore City where a few city blocks separate about $60,000 in per capita income. So there are these pretty strong local disparities. And what we at RESI wanted to do was kind of dig into some of the causes for these disparities. We wanted to work with local leaders to figure out what are some actionable short-term strategies that we can take, that we can pressure and communicate with local policymakers, with delegates down in Annapolis, to say, here are some things that we can do to help fix some of these issues in the short term. Again, because these are often disparities that have been simmering and put in place for generations upon generations, they're not things that are going to be solved overnight, but what are some things that we can do right now to sort of take the right step? And so we focused in on four kind of key topic areas. So we looked at food insecurity, we looked at education, access to employment, and public transportation. And if you kind of think about it, one way we kind of thought about framing out these four issues is that the causes of disparities, they really range across somebody's entire life. So you can be a child that is in Baltimore City public schools or in Howard County public schools, and if you are hungry, it is really, really difficult for you to have the same outcomes in your schooling as compared to someone that is not hungry. They're getting the right amount of support at home. Their parents do not have to, work 2 jobs to be able to support them. So you have things that happen down in childhood. You have educational attainment, so things in kind of the middle years, ages 18 when you're maybe graduating high school, up through your mid to late 20s when maybe you're graduating with an advanced degree. Once you enter the workforce, you need to be able to find a job. We spent a lot of time with Darius's excellent presentation looking at different job opportunities within the state, the forecast for those opportunities. And then, it's not just enough to have a job. You also have to be able to get access to that job. You have to be able to get from where you live to where you work to where your kids go to school to where your doctors are in order to be fully connected and be able to have the right levels of support that you need to lead a healthy and fulfilling life and to provide for your families. And so based off of the 4 roundtables that we had, I do see a lot of familiar faces in here from those roundtable sessions, so I'm really glad to see everybody. We had representatives from nonprofits and advocacy organizations, representatives from county and state government, institutions of higher education, public schools, private schools, just a really well-rounded group of people. We produced a lot of great ideas, really stimulating conversation on just kind of a personal note. I think it was some of I mentioned, that millennial passion earlier. I've never quite seen RESI staff so excited to stay late as they were after the roundtables, just kind of sit around and talk about the great ideas that just came out of each discussion. And so based on that, we created 4 policy briefs. Those are in the folders in front of you. You're welcome to take them home with you, a little light reading, put them under your pillow to really absorb everything that's in there. They're also available on our website, which is towson.edu/RESI. If you'd like to kind of have the digital version or send it to all your friends and family, that would be great too. And so the policy briefs that are in front of you, I do really want to pause here and just state that these were an absolute team effort, much like how Darius kind of thanked the full team. I may be up here on my own, and if you like the policy briefs, please come give me compliments afterwards. But this was really a full team effort. Every member of staff worked on these in some capacity. We had a whole crew of interns that worked their fingers to the bone as well, supporting this effort. And really, we couldn't have done it also without the continued support and engagement of the people that we worked with during the roundtables and who we stayed in touch with. Broadly, the 4 topic areas that we looked at were the Summer SNAP program, increasing Maryland's high school graduation rate, public-private partnerships, and bike commuting versus public transit opportunities. And so, I mentioned that one of the things that we want to start off with is thinking about healthy children and healthy families. And this is really critical locally because about 23.5% of Baltimore city residents live in what are termed healthy food priority areas, kind of the new term for a food desert. So there are 23.5% of Baltimore city residents that live somewhere where it's really difficult to easily and quickly get access to healthy and nutritious food. You may have to instead rely on going down to the corner store and getting much less healthy food, not quite the same availability of fresh produce or other choices. And this creates a vicious cycle. And we could put this slide up for pretty much every single one of the policy areas that we looked at. But just to kind of illustrate why these are issues that we kind of need to try and get in the middle of and sort of break. If you think about food insecurity, if you are hungry, there's going to be different coping strategies that you use. So you may eat a little less healthy, you may not exercise as much because you're hungry, you're just not feeling great. That's going to lead to increased levels of stress, increased chronic disease. As you get sicker, then you're going to need to go to the doctor more in order to kind of take care of those issues. It's less preventative care and more just being kind of more reactive, and that's what you're being forced into. Because you're going to the doctor, your healthcare costs are going up. You need to pay more for medications. You therefore have less disposable income to spend on things such as healthy and nutritious food, and then the cycle repeats again and again and again. And so this is why finding ways to target food insecurity, especially for children, is so critical. And when we convened the roundtable back in September around food insecurity, we were talking about, okay, well, what are some ways to address food insecurity? And one of the comments that we got during the roundtable was just, well, there's already a program in place that will do this, good news. There is SNAP, which is food stamps and food benefits. And roundtable participants stated that it is the most important and effective program that we have to combat food insecurity. And so it is directly giving money and giving benefits to households within the state of Maryland so that they can have access to healthy and nutritious food, not just for themselves, but for their family. And recently, as of last year, the Maryland legislature passed into law a new program that's called Summer SNAP. And so what Summer SNAP does is it provides $100 per child per year in increased SNAP benefits to families. And so $100 per child per year is not very much. It's only $30 per month during summer months and then $10 during the winter break. The thing here is that there are a lot of schools that are already providing free and reduced meals, and so but when children go home during the summer, they don't have access to that same level of support. So what do you do in the meantime? And so this is one way to try to get families access to some extra nutritious food. Of note, at the national level, when Summer SNAP-esque programs have been evaluated, they've done so looking at a $30 a month benefit, which is what's done in the state of Maryland, as well as a $60 a month benefit. While $30, at first I saw that and thought, oh, that's just, there's no way that could be enough money to actually make a real difference. $30 a month has about the same level of benefit as $60 a month. So even a relatively small sum of money really makes a huge difference in terms of reducing food insecurity, increasing positive childhood outcomes. And so the bill that was passed does obligate $200,000 in stateside funding to support these $100 payments. That's about 2,000 children. That could be supported by the current implementation of Summer SNAP. There is an additional piece within the legislation for matching local as well as some state funding there to provide additional support for counties. However, just want to note down here at the bottom that the original language for the bill, and if you kind of go on to the Maryland MGA website, you can see crossed out the original language authorized up to $2 million in funding for Summer SNAP, which would be obviously a huge boost up to about 20,000 children that would be able to be impacted. Of note, there are 246,000 children right now within the state of Maryland that are currently reducing free and reduced meals through their school. So even 20,000 is a relatively small drop in the bucket, but it would be kind of an additional way to step in and help combat food insecurity. And so what we wanted to do at RESI, we kind of heard loud and clear this outcome from the roundtable discussion back in September, which was that the Summer SNAP program was a really effective tool, and maybe perhaps policymakers should think about what it means to be funded at the original allocation instead of the current allocation. And so we said, okay, let's model what that means. We're economists. This is what we do for fun somehow. So let's take a look and see what it means to actually have $2 million in increased household income for households that are earning between $15,000 to $30,000. The median income for households that receive SNAP benefits is about $25,000, $27,000. It falls right in that range. But we do know that Maryland, we have a balanced budget requirement. We're going to be spending that $2 million anyway. In some way, that money is going to re-enter the economy. So it's not enough to just think about, in terms of economic impact, what that money is doing for those households, but how does that maybe compare to households' other alternative modes of spending that money? And so what we chose to kind of use as our comparison set here is what would happen if we spent $2 million instead on tax rebates or social assistance to households that are earning the median household income within the state of Maryland. And so we're kind of looking at the two things side by side that way. And so I think this is kind of a big high-level takeaway from the report. If you open it up, you'll see this is right splashed on our executive summary and then also again throughout the report. But every dollar invested in Summer SNAP, according to our analysis, yields $1.18 in economic output. There have been other studies that have been conducted looking at the economic benefits of spending on SNAP or SNAP-esque programs. Some of them have found slightly higher economic output multipliers. I should point out, I believe the USDA has their Economic Research Service estimates it's about $1.80 in increased economic output. They kind of have their own homebrew economic impact model that we did not necessarily want to replicate, just because using the in-plan model that we're using for the state of Maryland allows us to make comparisons a little bit better about how this funding might compare to alternative funding sources. But I do just kind of want to put that caveat out there that other studies have found slightly higher amounts. You can see that if there is $2 million in funding obligated towards Summer SNAP, that leads to an increase and support of 16 jobs within the state of Maryland. Those jobs will earn an average wage of about $44,000 each, which leads to increased employee compensation in the state of about $700,000. And about 7% of that original obligation flows back into state and local governments through the form of increased state and local taxes. That comes from income taxes as well as property taxes, et cetera. Because what happens when you have an additional household income boost is then people are going out to grocery stores, they're spending that money, they're able to take some money that they would have spent on groceries and shift that over to other necessities they might be falling behind on, such as utilities or rent. That money then continues to trickle through the economy and generate these larger multipliers that we're seeing. So the other thing that's important to think about, though, is how does this compare to our reference scenario where we're putting money just to sort of general household spending within the state of Maryland. And so the main takeaway here is that relative to at least the alternative option that we studied, Summer SNAP generates positive economic benefits for the state of Maryland. Investing $1 into Summer SNAP instead of investing that dollar into just a general tax rebate or social assistance program into households earning the median income results in a 4% increase in the amount of state and local taxes that the state is able to bring in. It increases the number of jobs and employment across the state by 13%, and increases output by 7%. And so I think this is, again, the benefit of being able to look at the Summer SNAP program using the lens of kind of our modeling versus sort of isolated models that may or may come out from other sources. And so, this is great that we see these economic benefits, and as much as it may pain me a little bit to say this as an economist, the economy and dollars and cents are not everything in the world. So I do not want to give the impression in either the policy brief or this presentation that when we're evaluating the Summer SNAP program or other programs where we're giving assistance to those in need, that it should only be considered in the lens of, well, what am I getting back from this, right? The benefit of Summer SNAP is really that you're providing children of all income levels all across the state with the ability to kind of live up to their full potential and realize their full potential. So there are going to be lower incidences of obesity and chronic disease. There have been a number of studies of SNAP and Summer SNAP-esque programs that have shown this. When children are sick less, they attend school more. And then because they are in school more, they are able to pay attention and focus more. There is an increase in school performance. And so that leads to better educational attainment, which transitions us into our next policy brief, which is focused on the high school graduation rate within Maryland. And what is the overall impact from that? And so I think if you have at all been following the news or just seen anything in passing, you are aware that the conversation around education has been dominated by the Kirwan Commission. In fact, the new president of the Senate in Maryland is a member of the Kirwan Commission. It's going to be very much a hot button issue this legislative session as the current governor is kind of arguing back and forth with legislators about what's the appropriate amount of funding for the Kirwan Commission. But underneath it all, what the Kirwan Commission is really setting out to do is this part that's highlighted in gold here. The Kirwan Commission is aiming to make the Maryland school system one of the best performing school systems in the world. And so what we wanted to do is kind of pause, think about what that means. So what does it mean for Maryland to have one of the best performing school systems in the world? Well, to start, it's going to mean that Maryland probably is going to have the highest high school graduation rate within the United States. Currently, Maryland's high school graduation rate sits at 89.2%, whereas the highest, which is very good, I should just kind of immediately point out, the highest high school graduation rate in the country right now is Iowa, which has a 93.3% high school graduation rate. So what we want to do is look at boosting Maryland's high school graduation rate up by 4.1 percentage points, up to 93.3%, which is maybe not necessarily as ambitious as the Kirwan Commission's ultimate goal of making our public school system one of the best in the overall world. But at least this is kind of a shorter term, let's just focus on the country right now approach. For the map, just so that you have kind of some context for what's going on, how some of the inputs are being modeled here. This is looking at high school graduation rate. Areas and counties that are modeled and shaded in red are those that have a high school graduation rate below the Maryland average, whereas counties in green have a high school graduation rate above the Maryland average. If we raise Maryland's graduation rates up to the level of Iowa, some of those very light green counties, such as Baltimore County, Allegheny County, they'll be, have high school graduation rates that rise as well. And so, I think it's important to think about what does having a high school degree mean. Well, one thing is that we know that if you have a high school graduation rate, that often corresponds with additional schooling. And so you can see that from this pie chart, pie charts are a really great visualization tool, but you can see that roughly equally, the amount of further education that you take on is what happens after high school. So about 24% are going to be going to end their education at high school. Another 24% are going to go on and get some college or an associate degree. Another quarter of students will go on and get a bachelor's, and another quarter are going to go on and get some sort of level of increased educational attainment there. And this is really important because, and Darius touched on this a little bit earlier, average earnings are much higher as your level of income goes up, and your level of education. This is, of course, more of a broad general statement. There are some fantastic opportunities in the skilled trades, for example, that do not require you to get an 8-year degree from one of the many institutions here in Maryland. But broadly speaking, as your level of education goes up, the level of income that you can expect to see goes up as well. And so what we did here at RESI is we said, okay, let's take a look at what's happening with expected high school classes now through 2040. And so we want to see, that's the furthest point out where we can get forecasts on school attendance and school enrollment and population from Maryland Department of Planning. And so what we want to do is take a look through 2040 at the different high school enrollments and then see what happens if we increase the number of graduates. And so for the class of 2021, let's say we start this off now. In a couple of years, we see this boost up to 93.1%, or 93.3. We would have 2,432 new graduates within the state of Maryland, based off of expected educational attainment, as well as progression to, say, associate degree, bachelor's degree, graduate degree. We are expecting then that would lead to an increase for those 2,432 new graduates. Each one of them would earn an expected $1.8 million in increased lifetime earnings. That goes out through 2068, so that's assuming retirement at the age of 65. Of course, if Darius's dismal predictions of working until he's 80 hold true, those lifetime numbers could go up a little bit higher. And then if you multiply 1.8 million by the 2,400 new students that we're expecting to see through 2068, so for lifetime earnings, the class of 2021 alone would see increased earnings of $4.4 billion. So just to kind of put that into context as we're thinking about expenditures to maybe get to a higher education attainment rate, there's pretty significant long-term effects. Obviously, that's going out over 40-some years, but there are pretty large numbers here. to help you kind of visualize this, the next slide here is looking at these increased annual graduate earnings over time. And so you'll notice that to lead things off, in 2021, we actually have negative $10 million there. And so you might think, well, if you have increased educational attainment, why is that? So first, we're modeling things off where there's a bit of a lag. So if you do not have a high school degree, what's going to end up happening is that you're just going to be immediately entering into the workforce. However, if you delay entering the workforce in order to pursue additional levels of education, say that's a college degree, master's degree, et cetera, you're going to be out of the workforce. So in the short term, you're going to be foregoing some immediate but smaller sum of money, and in the long term, you're going to be making that back. So again, harkening back to Darius's discussion of student loan debt and how there's all this student loan debt as doctors take on hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, but they're hoping to pay that back. This is something similar that we're seeing. So then, as these new classes enter into the economy, we're seeing that by 2040, there's an increase in personal income just in 2040 of about $1.4 billion in personal income. This is lower than that $4.4 billion in personal income I mentioned previously because this is stopping in 2040. It's not going all the way through 2068. There's about $100 million per year per class in increased personal income that does enter into the economy. So you do that over 28 years, you get some pretty substantial increases. This is just relatively short term over the next 20 years or so. And so again, similar to our analysis with SummerSnap, it's not just that initial upfront increase in personal income that's going to be going out throughout the economy, but as people have more money to spend, as Maryland becomes a more attractive place for people to live and work, personal income within the state is going to rise by even more. And so we see that by 2040, which also I should mention was negative 10 million, becomes negative 12 million in the first year. So some of those lows do get exaggerated, but then also the highs get higher. And so by 2040, you're up to well over $2 billion in increased personal income that is being supported within the state as a result of these new high school graduates entering the economy. A large part of that is due to some levels of in-migration because Maryland looks like a more, just great place to raise your family and to be. More people come in, which means there's going to be some additional spending and additional jobs that are created that way. And that's one of the main drivers that we're seeing. So I think it's important with any of these discussions to just kind of take a minute and pause and give some heavy caveats because deep down I'm an economist and that's what I have to do. This is not a comprehensive and full impact analysis of what would happen with an increase in educational attainment. So this analysis does not necessarily cover benefits as well as costs. So it is just kind of one piece of the picture, but it's a piece of the picture that often is a little bit harder to quantify when we think of how much money we're going to, say, give to teachers in increased salaries in order to kind of make sure we have better teachers to motivate higher outcomes. That's relatively easy to quantify. What's not as easy to quantify is what happens in the long run once those high school graduates enter the economy. And so there are several, there's going to be reduced spending on social services that the state will have to put out. That's a kind of cost savings to the state. Not going to be as high of spending on incarceration, hospitalizations. There's going to be decreased homelessness. There's also direct benefits that come from spending on the ways that you achieve higher high school graduation rates. So if you pay teachers more money, for example, if you hire more social workers, which is great because my wife is a social worker, so she'll be happy I said that. If you build more schools and renovate more schools, what you end up seeing is that money does also create some trickle-down effects throughout the economy and help stimulate it. There's also a series of non-economic benefits similar to SummerSnap where you just, in some ways, you can't put a price on just having a more equitable and just society. And so it is important to also caveat that as well. But improvements are great when we're thinking about adding 2,500 or so new graduates into Maryland's economy every year. But as Darius mentioned, we have pretty substantial gaps in our workforce right now. Right now, the number of job openings exceeds the number of people that are unemployed and looking for work. And so what that really signals, and Darius said this, is that there's a skills mismatch in our economy today. That there are people that are working that don't necessarily have the types of skills that employers are looking for. And so how do we address that issue? And so one way is through public-private partnerships. There's a quote on the right-hand side of the screen from one of the roundtable participants that really hits at this issue, which is, what would really be helpful are kind of concrete examples of successful public-private partnerships that our governments and our local institutions can use to sort of help model ourselves after, to really find those lessons learned from across the economy. And so if you're not familiar with what a public-private partnership is, it's as it sounds, it is a partnership between some sort of government agency as well as some sort of private company. Typically, a lot of them, in this context, we're really focusing on job training and job retraining opportunities. They're going to be providing residents of an area with access to new skills. And so we looked at 4 fairly successful public-private partnerships from across the US, one of which is in our own backyard here in Baltimore, the Project Reach, that's down at Hopkins. And there's, I think, a lot of really interesting lessons learned from these public-private partnerships. So there's the Center for Workforce Innovation in Atlanta, which I think the main takeaway here as you're reading through the policy brief is that it's really tailored to the anchor partners. So Atlanta has a lot of major employers within it. You have Delta, you have Coca-Cola, and these large anchor institutions are able to provide the workforce with immediate access to jobs upon completion of this program. And so you have the city of Atlanta that's working hand in hand with these very large anchor institutions to be able to train them for jobs that are immediately fillable. And the advantage of having the large anchor institution is that you can then have an immediate, very stable partner to be working with. There's also Project Quest down in San Antonio. One of the things that I think Project Quest does really, really well is that they provide a high level of wraparound services. There's a key recognition that as you're going through a program, there are a number of non-academic and academic barriers that need to be faced and addressed. So with Project Quest, they're providing students with guidance counseling, utility assistance, childcare assistance. You may need to find a place to put your child while you're doing this job retraining program. Otherwise, how can you hope to attend the classes, get the skills that you need to get a job? Thirdly, there's Project Reach here in Baltimore. It's partnered through Johns Hopkins. One of the things that's really interesting and great about Project Reach is that while they are conducting the retraining for participants in these programs, they are continuing to pay employees their full wages and benefits. So one of the things that we heard in the roundtable is that one of the major barriers to job training programs is that people have to forego their income in order to take on these programs. And so while it might be better in the long run, they can't really afford to take that hit because they need to pay rent now. They need to pay their utilities now. And so the great thing about Project Reach is that it offers people that ability to do that while still training for the long term. And then last but not least, there's the Colorado Workforce Development Council, which in contrast to the public-private partnership in Atlanta, is really focused on a broad range up to 750 small businesses. So instead of working with a few relatively stable large companies, the Colorado Workforce Development Council is able to go across a much broader range of industries. So if there's something that you're interested in, it's much easier to get access to those skills. It can be a little bit more flexible and nimble to on the ground conditions. But you also sacrifice some of the stability and just kind of knowledge of, okay, I go through this program, this is who I can expect to get a job with. They're a major company that's been around for 100 years, and I can continue to have a job probably through retirement. So again, just to recap, the lessons learned here for local leaders are really focusing in on those support services and other barriers. And then before jumping into a public-private partnership, it's important to structure it in such a way that you understand who your partners are. Are your partners a large anchor institution or a series of large anchor institutions, or do you have more small companies in the area? Because that's really going to impact how you fund the program, how you advertise the program, and what types of skills and industries people can hope to get into. And so we talked about this through the last presentation, touched on it with the question and answer session, but it's all well and good to find a job. But the next thing is it's important to be able to get access to that job. And within Maryland, car ownership is strongly linked with unemployment. This is a just scatter plot looking at census tract level and correlating access to a car by household against the unemployment rate. Within Maryland, this is looking at households, the percent of households that have access to a car within the city of Baltimore. Those census tracts that are shaded in red are those census tracts where a lower percentage of households have access to a car than the Maryland average, whereas those census tracts in green are those with a access rate above the Maryland average. And you can see that because there is relatively high or relatively low levels of access to a vehicle, it's really important that we identify other modes of transportation that might be able to connect people and residents of our city and our state with the workforce opportunities that exist, with all those new jobs that are coming down in Sparrows Point, with the job centers that we have here in Towson or downtown Baltimore. And so one way that you can do that is by public transportation. We heard a lot in the roundtable about other mobility modes, micromobility, the e-scooters that you may see kind of everywhere, as well as just your traditional standard bike to work commute. We have here at RESI, I'll put him on the spot, but one of our staff members commutes by bike 50 minutes from Federal Hill up to Towson almost every single day. It is a long commute, but oftentimes that bike route is a little bit faster and more reliable than our public transportation system, even though the red line kind of generally goes straight up and down York Road. And so what we wanted to do was think about and comment on job accessibility by different modes of transportation. So if you live in a given block group within Baltimore City or Baltimore County, a block group is just a geographic term for an area that's bigger than a block, smaller than a census tract or a neighborhood, has about 600 to 3,000 residents within it. For residents of that block group, how many jobs are you able to access by a different commute mode within a given time frame? And so we looked at all 1,182 block groups within Baltimore City and Baltimore County, and we compared the commute times for each one to every single other block group within Baltimore City and Baltimore County. So our computers ran for several hundred hours crunching through the millions of observations and route times there. We then brought that in and merged it with data on job data at the block group level, as well as different characteristics of those jobs. Are they manufacturing jobs? Are they jobs for workers that require a high school degree? Are they high income, lower income jobs, et cetera? And so up on the screen here, we see these are two maps that map out the total number of accessible jobs via public transportation at the block group level. On the left is the number of jobs for residents within 30 minutes, and on the right is within 45 minutes. And so what you can really see is on the left-hand side of the screen, there is a much lower level of job accessibility within just a half hour than you might expect. And part of that is one of the reasons and the barriers that comes along with public transportation is it's not just that you hop on the bus and then you hop off the bus and you're right there. There are a lot of relatively fixed time constraints that you have. There's what's called the first mile and last mile issues. So there's the time and distance it takes for you to get from your house to the very first public transportation stop that you're going to be on. There's also the time it takes from you to get from your last public transportation stop to your place of work or your final destination. You also have time that's spent just waiting around for the bus to arrive, as well as the time where you're needing to be spent waiting around for any transfers that come. And so within 30 minutes, as you can see on the left, you can access a relatively few number of jobs. Really what happens within a half hour is that you're able to get to the jobs that are located right downtown, right in your sort of immediate area. So if you live downtown, you can access those jobs. When you expand up to 45 minutes, just an additional 15 minutes, because you have most of those upfront fixed costs taken care of and they're held steady, that additional 15 minutes is all transit time. And so you can really see the benefits associated with having a slightly longer commute. You can get from downtown, not only can you still access all of the jobs that are downtown, but because Baltimore City and Baltimore County have sort of a hub and spoke model where all routes sort of lead to downtown, you can then get access to all of the jobs that are in the outlying suburbs, such as Towson, Owings Mills, relatively quickly. You can hop on the metro from downtown and get up to State Center. You can take the red line up to Towson. You can hop on the light rail and get fairly close to Hunt Valley. And then you can also see that in just sort of the outlying reaches here on the right-hand map. So you have the metro line that you can see, but of note is you'll notice if you're kind of familiar with the geography of the area, the dark green shades don't extend all the way out to Owings Mills where the metro terminates, or all the way up to Hunt Valley where the light rail terminates. And that's because even at 45 minutes, it still takes a little bit of time to get to those stations and then drive, commute down into downtown or some other final destination. In contrast, what we did is look at biking and the number of jobs accessible by biking, and you kind of get this amorphous purple blob that you see up here on the screen. The advantage of biking is that you don't necessarily have to do the same things you have to do with biking. There's not really a first mile, last mile issue as much. You can just walk out your door, hop on your bike, and go someplace. You don't necessarily need to rely on a series of fixed routes, although obviously some roads are much easier and much better to bike on than others. And so you have a little bit more flexibility with time, with where you are able to kind of route yourself. If there are delays due to traffic and morning rush hour, you can find better paths. And so you really see that it's just sort of this density of jobs pretty much all throughout Baltimore City, but really mostly around the downtown area is really where biking truly shines. So then what we did here is we just kept going and analyzing, and so we kind of took these commutes and we said, well, look, biking and public transportation are not necessarily comparable for a given commute time. If I offered you the choice between generally sitting on the light rail for 30 minutes versus 30 minutes of semi-strenuous exercise on a bike, I personally would pick the light rail. I don't know about you. You're exposed to the elements a bit more when you're biking. There's concerns about traffic safety and exposure to cars, especially Baltimore drivers. And so it's not necessarily fair to compare them one-to-one 30-minute commute to 30-minute commute. So what we did is we looked at how many jobs were accessible by biking within 30 minutes versus public transportation in 60 minutes. And so what you see here, the areas in green are still those areas. Green is for public transit, purple is more for biking. So areas that are green to really, really dark green, those are areas where public transportation offers residents the most advantages, whereas those areas that are purple are those that offer residents the most total number of jobs accessible via bike. And there's a couple things that are really interesting to point out with this map. So the number one thing is that you can pretty clearly see right downtown public transportation is king. You can access most of the jobs either just by walking a few blocks in either direction or by hopping on the bus line or fixed rail line out to the suburbs. There's also an area, kind of an outer ring, right along the Baltimore City, Baltimore County line. And that is sort of the boundary where about 60 minutes of a commute is able to take residents from those block groups and pull them into downtown and offer the highest number of accessible jobs. And it just really outperforms biking in that regard. You can also see the advantages of the fixed rail lines that we have in the region. The kind of exceptions to that just outer ring stopping at the Baltimore City, Baltimore County line are the metro line and the light rail line that extends up into the north midpoint of Baltimore County there. What you also see are some areas where biking offers some pretty decent advantages. So along York Road and kind of the block groups that are outlying there, as well as around the light rail, what you see in northern Baltimore County are areas with darker shades of purple. And those are areas where the bus routes just aren't quite as able to kind of funnel people into York Road as effectively as if you just hopped on your bike and got on and were able to access either the jobs accessible in downtown Towson or those jobs accessible, say, at McCormick up in Cockeysville. You know, there are a number of job centers that aren't just in downtown Baltimore. The other area, which I think is really interesting to kind of examine, is what we've kind of dubbed this inner ring of neighborhoods. And these are the neighborhoods that are in between that dark green downtown core and the dark green outer ring on the Baltimore City, Baltimore County line. And so these neighborhoods are some of the neighborhoods in Baltimore City that have the lowest levels of outcomes for residents. Harken back to that map of HDI, you'll notice that they're the areas with lower levels of education, income, life expectancy, any other kind of statistic that you want to put up on the map there. So there's these inner neighborhoods within West Baltimore and East Baltimore especially, where biking tends to offer similar levels of access as public transportation. At 60 minutes, public transportation offers just slightly more by a few percentage points, some transportation advantages there. If you bring that down to, say, the average commute time by public transportation, which is 50 minutes or more of an ideal amount of 45, the advantages for biking just kind of go through the roof. And what this really implies is that these neighborhoods are kind of key neighborhoods to focus on for an increase in bike lane infrastructure and other targeted policies. One reason is that, you know, we see, okay, biking has a lot of advantages, but, you know, only 1% or so of Baltimore City residents actually commute by bike. So it's all well and good for me to stand up here and say, boy, look at all the jobs you can get to by a bike, but why don't people actually do that? And there are a number of reasons. The number one reason across all sort of groups is safety, especially as it relates to traffic safety and interactions with vehicles. It is, you know, there are a lot of very busy roads between downtown Towson and downtown Baltimore. You know, if you bike along York Road, Charles Road, if you cross Northern Parkway, Cold Spring, these are pretty major roads where you're going side by side with vehicles the whole time. This is especially true if you're trying to bike in sort of an east-west corridor, say along North Avenue, although there is North Ave Rising, some increased bike lanes that are going in there. There's also cost. So for a survey of residents in Philadelphia, Brooklyn, and Chicago, they looked at different groups and kind of said, well, what are your main, why don't you bike more? And the number one response for residents of those cities that were lower income residents of color was cost, that they were not able to afford the upfront cost of a bike because the bicycle can be expensive upfront. It's much easier to pay $1 or so every day in bus fare or light rail fare than it is to pay the oftentimes hundreds of dollars upfront for a decent bicycle that will be able to get you where you need to go. There are also a lot of logistical issues. So bike racks are not available and are not distributed equally across the city. That's definitely a major thing that you need to focus on if you're biking is where am I going to keep the car the bike when I'm home? Do I have a place to keep it? When I get to work, is there some place to store it? Because if a bike is relatively expensive, this is not necessarily going to be something that I want just sitting outside where someone can just pick it up and go. And finally, there's a lot of practicality concerns. Public transportation offers you the ability to take your children with you, for example, if you need to get to daycare or to doctor's appointments. There's a lot of just, you don't maybe necessarily want to be out in the rain and ice and cold every day. And so thinking about public safety and thinking about this inner ring of neighborhoods, so the final map that we have here for you guys is this map produced by the Baltimore City of Transportation and some of their associates. The areas that are in yellow are low-stress biking islands, they've dubbed them. And so they're areas where you can commute by bike relatively easily and safely, where even those who are relatively inexperienced bikers are not going to be feeling, too like it's too much. However, you can see there are a lot of major roads that crisscross Baltimore City, east, west, north, south. And so what those really do is inhibit biking and inhibit commuting by biking across the city. So if you're living in West Baltimore, you're going to have to cross a lot of roads. You can see it gets really, really dense when you get into downtown. which is, again, an advantage of public transportation, is that you don't necessarily have to rely on crossing those same busy roads and being exposed. The good news, though, is that Baltimore already has a lot of existing plans that can be drawn upon and implemented relatively quickly, easily. And those are, there's the 2015 biking master plan. There's a 2017 addendum, which really focuses on separated bike lanes and creating a network of separated bike lanes. A lot of those would go along the barriers and those major busy roads. However, I should point out that in the 2017 addendum, there were a number of bike lanes that were set to be completed by the end of this year, and they are not on schedule as of yet. Several of those are in that east-west corridor. So targeting those areas and making sure that Baltimore City and the county continue to follow through on those plans is, I think, going to be critical. And there's also the recently passed at the end of 2018, the Complete Streets Ordinance, which builds off of this 2017 addendum to the master plan, really argues for ensuring that we think about all different types of mobility, whether that be bicycles or e-scooters or other forms of access across the city. So kind of using these, drawing upon these, building on these is definitely strongly recommended because there are a lot of neighborhoods within the area that offer so many advantages. So to conclude, there's a lot here. You guys have some next steps you got some light reading. Again, there's about 60, 70 pages of just real easy. There's a lot of pictures, so don't worry too much. We're really viewing these policy briefs as preliminary research that we're going to be building on and thinking about later. So we would love to kind of keep this conversation going with you, with everybody in this room. And we really want to figure out what are ways that we can expand upon this research, what are things we can incorporate, what are we missing, and then the final step is, I think, again, these policy briefs are launching points for you to kind of think about how we can continue these conversations in our community. And with that, I want to thank you all very much. We have a Q&A session right now, but you can also corner me outside, and we'll be great. Does anybody at this time have any questions? Yes. Yes.
And sorry, can you hear me? I have a quick question in reference to the SNAP program and the allotment of $30 a month for this summer.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious, considering that it was noted that there was a lower incidence of obesity and chronic disease, but how would that be possible if the majority of people impacted are in healthy food priority areas? Where are they accessing the healthy food to lower their incidence of obesity and chronic disease?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. And I think it really, it really just kind of reinforces the idea that there can't just be a one-size-fits-all approach. And even with, say, food insecurity, and we're looking at summer SNAP, it's not enough to just say, well, we're giving families $30 a month, we did it, let's pat ourselves on the back and go home, everybody. I mean, the disparities and the outcomes that we're seeing that vary so much across the city and across the state can't just be solved by one approach. They can't just be solved overnight. And I think this is one example, right? So if you have additional money, that's great. But if it requires you to have to take a longer bus ride to still continue to feed your kids, that's still a barrier. And so even having additional funding for summer SNAP programs, it's not necessarily a panacea that's going to make food insecurity go away. There has to be a really comprehensive a strategy and approach here. So, great. Anybody else? Oh, yes.
I'm really interested in the Kirwan Commission.
Mm-hmm.
Kirwan Commission. So generally speaking, I think it's pretty clear that we can all understand the positive benefits of having a much higher graduation rate and going on to matriculating into even higher degrees.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, have you or do you know if anyone else has done a study of like the opportunity costs? If we're funneling that money into education, what aren't we paying for, and or the tax increase that we have, how does that affect household spending, et cetera? And the second question of the second part of the question is a little bit more difficult, but
Not interested then.
how do we know? I mean, I understand a lot about the Kirwan Commission. I understand how they came up with their plan. And I think that was brilliant and sound, their strategy for coming up with their plan. But how do we know if it's going to actually end up in the results that they're expecting with this world-class education and graduation rates?
Yeah. No, those are both two really, really good questions. So to answer the first, the easy one, and then I'll stop there. I'm not familiar with any studies that have examined, done a full comprehensive review of the Kirwan Commission and all of their recommendations. This analysis and this policy brief that is looking at the increase in outcomes for the state of Maryland associated with having best-in-country graduation rates is also not necessarily, even an analysis of what would happen under the Kirwan Commission. I think it's a little bit conservative, given some of the stated goals of the Kirwan Commission are not just to maybe be best in country, but to be, far above the country and be best in world. I think some of the difficulties that we had in thinking about this policy brief is that, it is unclear, and to get to your second point, it's unclear what level of funding is absolutely necessary to get us to a given graduation rate and an increase in outcomes. We don't know if, for example, just increasing, having universal pre-K would be enough to get us there, or hiring additional social workers to focus on the trauma in schools. How much of an increase in teacher salaries is going to lead to, is that going to lead to increased attainment? Those are really difficult and hard to untangle questions that, for the state of Maryland, I don't think anybody has done a comprehensive review of both the benefits and the cost. We tried to lay out what some of those are, but I'm not aware of kind of anyone that's gone in, especially that's used any type of modeling software outside of just laying out those specific costs. But then I think you're right that we don't know what amount of funding is required in order to get us to those rates. And I think, I would hope at least that as policymakers are thinking about how we move forward with the Kirwan Commission, that there is some of that kind of adaptability of, okay, we're talking about $3.8 billion today, but if we find that it's only, say, $2.7 billion that's necessary, can we kind of, move that a little bit? And adjust. I'm guessing that, if I had a crystal ball, I think there's definitely going to be more of an incremental approach that's taken. Not let's fund it at $3.8 billion and then cut back to 2.7, but rather let's kind of step this up as we go along and see how close we're getting to desired outcomes. I do also think that, one of the main outcomes from this policy brief and the research here is showing that, it isn't just the direct benefits of giving teachers an increase in salary, because then they'll have more money to spend and stimulate the economy. Giving those with lower incomes, and we saw this in the summer SNAP, not that teachers earn $15,000 to $30,000 a year on average, but they're relatively underpaid for the level of education, the level of commitment that they have to go through. And that's money that's generally better spent because they're not going to be saving as much money. It's going to be just going right back into the economy. It has more trickle effects than other alternative things. There's going to be money on construction. You'll have additional construction workers. There's the reduction in spending on a variety of social services. But it's a really difficult to unentangle process. Any other? Yes.
So when you talked about the bike lanes and changing, it made me think, when you're doing your research, what was qualified as a job? Someone who can ride a bike, is it going to be beneficial for them to have this increase in a job? Would they want the job? We know that you put in several factors that would deny them from really using the bike, like health and safety and things like that. But what's the benefit in saying that there's jobs available? Like, does it benefit the person that could ride the bike? That's
Yeah, so the metric that we're looking at, which is the total number of jobs that are available via a particular commute mode within a certain amount of time, that is looking at the number of existing jobs that exist within that block group. So if you're looking at downtown Baltimore, all of the jobs in the World Trade Center, for example, just get counted in. If you can reach there in 45 minutes via bus, you have access to all of those jobs. There are a couple of different pieces with that. One is that not everyone can access all of the jobs that are, say, just in the World Trade Center. Not everyone has, and we touched on this with the other policy briefs, not everyone has the requisite level of training and education. So, they might not be able to fully take advantage of having access to those jobs. One thing to kind of comment on the different types of jobs that are available, we don't have it up on the screen, but within the policy brief and sort of the end of it, we do have a couple maps that look at the number of jobs that are accessible that are jobs that currently are held by workers with a high school degree. And you can see that for those jobs, there is an increase in availability for those workers that are commuting via bike as opposed to via public transportation. An increase in that metric it's hard to quantify. But ideally what you would be seeing is that there is an increase in job accessibility, which if you have more options available to you, in theory, you should be able to have a higher income because you are able to find something that kind of best matches your particular situation. Having more alternative modes of transportation. I think the other thing that I maybe didn't stress in the presentation, but I perhaps ought to have, is that these are really complementary modes. It's not, I think, enough to just say, is it biking or public transportation or vehicle, but it's really, if you have that increased flexibility, you can kind of do it all, and that's really, really a good thing. But ideally what we'd like to see is the more jobs that are available to a given person, then they have an increased likelihood of finding a job, being able to get to a job. It's one thing to say, I live in Sandtown, Winchester, there's a job out in, deep in Reisterstown. Well, I can't get there, so, that doesn't do me any job. It doesn't do me any good. If you have a more interconnected network where you're able to get to all the different block groups easier, then you have an increased likelihood that you'll be able to get to those jobs that are available, the 120,000 jobs that are available right now within the state of Maryland. And it means that you are likelier to have an increased income when you do get that job. But obviously, and again, it gets back to the barriers, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach because there are people that have different levels of ability. There are people that have different childcare situations. But that's all. Thank you all very much. We're going to have a networking time period where we can all just kind of mingle. So please feel free to find me if you have any other follow-up comments. Find Arias. Find any of the other RESI staff members. In most cases, they're better able to even talk about these policy briefs than I am, and they would love to talk about it. So thank you all very much for coming, and I hope to see you in May at our Outlook Forum.